Welcome back to another podcast episode. Time for a quick roundup of the latest headlines making news. The highly anticipated Canadian federal election is officially underway. Prime Minister Mark Carney has called a 5-week campaign with Canadians heading to the polls on April 28th. As candidates hit the trail, we're seeing key issues emerge, from cutting taxes, improving housing affordability, growing Canadian businesses and industry, and a huge, growing wave of patriotism and economic nationalism that's taking center stage. One phrase you'll be hearing a lot: elbows up. It's become a rallying cry for Canadians in response to Trump's tariffs and Canadian sovereignty. With tensions running high and election platforms taking shape, we're here to break down what it all means for you. But before we get there, we're diving into the last chapter of our 3-part series with economist Don Drummond. In today's episode, we're diving into the story of how former Finance Minister Jim Flaherty and former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, alongside key government institutions, worked together to steer Canada through the 2008 financial crisis. It was a true collaborative Team Canada moment. But what does former Prime Minister Stephen Harper have to say about it? Fast forward to today. Are we still taking that Team Canada collaborative approach? Or has economic decision-making become too divided? With major challenges in housing, immigration, and trade, can we get back to smart, coordinated policy? Full disclaimer, this episode was recorded on March 7th, 2025, so some news may have changed since then, but the ideas remain just as relevant. So stay tuned, and let's talk economics with Don Drummond. We were recently quoted in a Globe and Mail piece about Stephen Harper's comments on Mark Carney's track record. And in this article, there was an interesting quote here from someone else, not yourself, but how Harper is being called to save Pierre Poilievre from a historic drop in support. But no amount of revisionist history can take away from Mr. Carney's proven record of economic leadership. And this article is really focusing on how Harper was criticizing and falsely accusing Carney on these pieces of his economic leadership. What I'm kind of wrapping around here too is you had said, and it's hard to point fingers of who during the financial crisis, who was really taking that leadership, whether it's Jim Flaherty or Mark Carney. It was a collective approach. And you said here, quote, it's kind of hard to get worked up about, somebody did a better job than somebody else. Monetary and fiscal policy worked quite well together. What was that monetary and fiscal policy at that time that helped get us Canadians out of that and not be hit as hard as the Americans in 2008?
Well, I got to go one step before that, because it wasn't our policy response that made the impact less severe here. I even have to go one step before that. Actually, in terms of output, our hit was about the same as the United States. The two distinguishing factors is we didn't have the collapse of the housing sector, and we didn't have the plummet as deeply as employment. But the flip side of that is the Americans didn't have the big loss in productivity as we did. The reason we didn't get hit so far was because we had a much more solid financial sector. We had better regulations, and the Canadian banks, because of their conservative approach, not only had higher capital requirements and lower permissible leverage ratios, they were actually operating with more capital than they needed to do. And that just reflected their conservative perspectives. We didn't have subprime mortgages in Canada. And you ask yourself, why didn't TD have subprime mortgages? The answer is because RBC, our main competitor, didn't. And I'm sure if you asked RBC why they didn't have subprime mortgages, they would say because TD didn't. And the answer why both of them did it is because they're getting about 28% returns on an equity from not going out very far in the risk curve. So we had a solid sector that could withstand that. We didn't have the Lehman Brothers and the like. I mean, if you look at the leverage ratio that Lehman was operating at, it was just flabbergasting. And no Canadian financial institution had ever been above that. Now, that being said, we were not immune from the hit to the United States and the other economies, and we needed dramatically increased liquidity and ease monetary conditions. The Bank of Canada did that very quickly and very strenuously. We needed fiscal support, And in fact, if I were to be picky, the criticism would be the Conservative government at that time was a bit slow to get going on the program on the fiscal support. They did come on fulsomely. The OECD and the IMF are suggesting all countries increase fiscal stimulus 2 to 4% of gross domestic product, and Canada ultimately did that, but we did it lagging other countries, not leading it. But, the Minister of Finance, who is a member of the board of the Bank of Canada, and the governor of the Bank of Canada have always met weekly. I'm sure during the financial crisis, they met probably daily, and they work together. The governor of the Bank of Canada may offer a view on fiscal policy, but that's not his domain. That's the Minister of Finance. Flaherty, as the Minister of Finance, led that. I'm sure the Minister of Finance offered a view on monetary policy, but the Bank of Canada is independent, and Mark Carney did that. And we've had all kinds of times where monetary and fiscal policy have been working at cross purposes, but they were working in conjunction. So I think, give me a break. It's not all the credit of Mark Carney. It's not all the credit of Jim Flaherty. Give them credit for what they each did and give them credit. They work together well. Good for them. And let's not forget the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions did a good job as well. They kept high capital requirements. They kept the liquidity ratios down. And if we think about, what we're going through right now, why are we not facing a mortgage disaster with all these people having to renew at higher rates? Well, the introduction of the stress test from OSFI going back several years is a good part of that answer. Why are people now being able to avoid bankruptcy when they're facing 2 percentage points high mortgage rate? Well, because they had to qualify for that a couple of years ago. So let's give some credit to 3 organizations in this case that worked well together. I would add and back in that day, a 4th one, and that was the CMHC. When the banks were having difficulty borrowing, the banks were giving access to lending done by the CMHC. That was a brilliant idea because it allowed the banks to finance money at a lower rate than they were able to face themselves. So really, all of the arms of the government, including the Bank of Canada, worked very well together at that and did ultimately get us through it.
Yeah, and it's teamwork. At the end of the day, all these arms are working together to benefit and better Canadians. So I personally, working in politics, have seen a bit of that shift in this, my team, your team, and that ideological. And I really hope we can get a little bit more back to that Team Canada approach, especially in light of what we're seeing, everything with the tariffs and the economic pressures. But I want to go to your point about Canada's housing market. OSFI, CMHC, Canada's seen housing bust before, most notably in the early 1990s, when low commodity prices, high national debt, a weaker dollar, all these, different elements, the threat of Quebec's independence. But Canada's housing market has been resilient and even robust, some would argue. But how might it fare with the U.S. tariffs and lower immigration flows? Because we are seeing, I feel like with media now, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. We're seeing a lot of vacancies in buildings because a lot of buildings were being built to accommodate the high influx of immigrants. So, how might the housing market fare with the U.S. tariffs and these lower immigration flows?
Even being an economist, I still have to, but it is somewhat perplexing that an entire discipline is created around one idea, and that's supply and demand. There's hardly anything in the field of economics that you can't boil down to supply and demand, and this is a classic example. So for 3 years, we brought in well over 1 million people. Even if there was an average of 2 people together on each time, and it wasn't even quite that, that's over 500,000 households coming in per year. And we create about 250,000 housing units. How do you like the supply and demand of that? Like, we already had a shortage of housing, and then we had a demand that was over double the flow of the influx. That had to be a disaster, and it's just a classic failure of coordinating policy, because you had one branch, immigration, working totally in ignorance of another reality of the housing side. I mean, we could expand that to healthcare as well. We have the supply of physicians that have been increasing about 1% per year in Canada. And then for several years, we had a population increase of over 3%. How do we like the supply and demand of that? That made absolutely no sense. So we ended up with this difficulty access to affordable housing, and we've ended up with this difficulty of access to primary care. None of them all pinned out all on immigration, but it made no sense. So these lower immigration numbers are absolutely essential. The fraud that was going on the foreign students on the private college side in particular had to be addressed. And for a while, that will be lower numbers. We shouldn't abandon the foreign student market by any way. It's a great way of getting talent into Canada. It's a great way of making contracts around the rest of the world. But the numbers is totally got out of shape. But it's not just about numbers. It's who we bring in. And we changed our selection criteria. We decided that there was a great idea to bring in people to fill low-wage, low-skilled jobs. So that doesn't do them any good. It creates a type of society I don't think Canadians want to stand for. It takes low pay. It's not going to increase our productivity. We used to focus on high-skilled people who were coming into the jobs that we needed. We need to get back onto that kind of track. The minister himself said the immigration system got out of control. We need to bring it back in control. More reasonable numbers for a time as a start of that, but we need to sharpen the selection criteria and we need to improve the settlement devices.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The amount of people that I met, you can go in an Uber and ask them where they're from, and they're like, oh, I'm an engineer or a heart surgeon back in my own country. And
well, some of them, again, there's nothing like a good crisis to make some improvements. So, we had this years-long delay in recognizing the credentials of foreign trade nurses, for example, in Ontario, just sitting on this huge stockpile. It would take years to go through it. And where were they working? And the same, well, they were obviously working in positions that didn't require a license because they didn't have one. We had this desperate need for them. They're sitting right there. And then the process was very clumsy because often it may be deemed that maybe they're only 2 courses short, but they send them back virtually to start all over again. So that process has been accelerated. There's been a lot of people that have gone through that. We should have done that before we got a crisis, but we're doing that. But you look at the silliness of teachers, for example. We have at least 5 different accreditation bodies across the country. And at least to some degree, they have a passport system. My own daughter's an example of that because Arizona State University offers a master's in teaching in a 1-year program. She decided to get it here, and she has to go to each individual province to get accredited. She applied in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. Ontario basically said she had to start all over again, not just her master's degree, but her entire bachelor's. British Columbia said she had to do 6 more credits, and Saskatchewan said she had to do 2. So she went to Saskatchewan, and then from the passport system after a way in Saskatchewan got in Ontario. What an inefficient mess. I mean, the country's not that different. The teachers are teachers. They're tending to teach sort of the same kind of credentials and should have the same kind of background. And what they taught at the Arizona is a wonderful program here. They should have said, oh, well, you got a master's in teaching in Arizona. You're in. Happy to have you. But, there's sillier things. Speaking of Arizona, when you get a degree here, you get a 1-year working permit. And she taught in Tucson in what's called a Title I district, which is code name for a very impoverished area, almost an entirely Latino population, with a master's, got paid the whopping sum of $34,000 a year and was not allowed to stay after 1 year. Even though they cannot hire a qualified teacher, 1/3 of the adults in Arizona teachers do not have teaching credentials, and yet they will not take somebody from Canada or elsewhere. So we're pretty stupid, but there's worse. And of course, the Arizona scholastic results, not only are they bad across the country in the United States, but Arizona has amongst the worst. And yet the door's open to try to fix that, and they're not doing it.
Yeah, and I think the issues around education are just going to only be exacerbated with the Trump administration. We're already seeing, cuts in.
Oh, we're seeing the tax on it, and how do you build a high-value, high-income economy? And, the whole notion is, well, we're trying to get back to this blue-collar skill work and stuff, but anybody who thinks that hasn't been through a factory plant. It's not the way it was before. There's sophisticated operations. One of my eye-openers, I had a wonderful opportunity. It was near the end of my period at TD. I got to walk the factory line of the Sierra truck, and I actually walked beside the last truck made at the Oshawa plant, from where it came into the plant until it ended. So I got to see what each person was done and got to speak to the people. And that was really fascinating. It was fascinating for labor relations as well, because they had an opportunity to make a suggestion to how the processes would be improved. And the employees were so invested in that, and they made these wonderful suggestions. So they were saying, like, one person for hours on end would operate this bolt machine of putting the bolts on the doors, and very tedious work. And they were saying, don't have me doing that forever. but keep moving them around and keeping them trained so they can do multiple types of jobs. And I'm sure that enhanced the productivity of the place. I used to say that at TD because we on high would dictate the processes to all the employees throughout the organization about how did we know how to do it efficiently, give them an opportunity to determine. That comes back to sort of my theme on the productivity side. You have to invest the workers with an ability to shape the workplace and increase the productivity themselves. And usually they have wonderful ideas.
Yeah, very well said. And a really interesting example. And I'm doing the Masters of Public Administration at Queen's. I'm wearing my sweater here for alma mater. That was a really key piece I learned from that program is making sure you're getting the voices that are actually being impacted by these things and seeing the process. Because I think the illusion is, how can people in Ottawa who've never stepped foot on an oil rig in Alberta, or someone who's experiencing something in Newfoundland or Halifax, don't have the same reality as someone who's making the policy who's only ever lived in Toronto or only ever lived in Ottawa. So I think seeing on the ground or even getting those perspectives are just so critical.
I learned two lessons of that. The first was Paul Martin had this idea to income test the old age security payments on a family basis. Seems like a good idea. It went really badly politically, and I was charged with his parliamentary secretary, David Walker, member of parliament from Manitoba, to go across the country and convince elderly people this was a great idea. Boy, did we get beaten up. And the key issue, which I had not understood, was the large percentage of women for which the old age security check was their only access to money. But that was an eye-opener. You're sitting there in your office and you're kind of perplexed. Why is there so much animosity to this idea? But you go out in the field and you quickly realize that they have a very different perspective of how their lives are conducted in a different way than you thought it was. And your policy has to reflect that. And so one time we temporarily had an idea before the whole thing was abandoned. It was if there was a check, it would go into the name of the lower income earner. Sexist code for it would go to the woman, and more often the case. But a good example, one of the rare cases where you go and meet the people and you come back with a different idea. But I had the wonderful opportunity, I worked with a TD Bank, of being in the room with CEOs of companies, and I would ask them, like, why are you not trying to grow your company above $500,000? And it was fascinating, their reasons. Actually, many of them were based on a misunderstanding of the tax system. And I was kind of perplexed by that. Don't you have access to it? And I was also, why are they not making more? We have a pretty lucrative tax credit for research and development. Why are they not making more use of it? And then they started explaining the horrendous process and costs of applying for it. And most of them, at least the first time they applied for it, actually paid a middle person to do it who took much of the process. I didn't know that. So you can sit there in your office in Ottawa and you look at the design and it says, looks good to me. And then why is it not being used? You realize, at a practical, on the ground, it's the reality is quite a bit different than it appears from sitting in your office. So you better understand.
Absolutely. I saw it firsthand working in a constituency office and having to reach out to Ottawa to get lines about whatever the issue is. And I'm like, I can't tell somebody this. It's so like open-ended, flat line. You're not considering the reality of what they're experiencing right now, whatever the policy is. And when I did eventually move on to the Hill, like I really brought that perspective because I think it's so important. And that also comes to mind. I worked on the seniors file and going back about women, my male colleagues, when we were talking about increasing the widow's pension or even increasing the OAS, they didn't understand why women who typically live longer than their male partners, who also earn less of a wage, didn't have as much maybe saving, or they were working as a homemaker rather than in the workforce, are living in higher levels of poverty. And for me, it was just something that was just like, yeah, that makes sense. But I had to actually break it down and explain it to like my male colleagues.
Yeah, this is an example. I got so sick of high-income people on Bay Street telling me that people on welfare are on welfare because they don't want to work. And I said, no, in most cases they're on welfare because they're actually better off on welfare than taking a minimum wage job. And so I tried to do it in the typical economist way, and it just became unfathomable because there's over 100 cells in the Ontario matrix for welfare. So I just picked two individuals. I took a single male and I took a single woman with a school-aged child. And I put them in various different positions and calculated what they would get earning on their own and what they would get under welfare. And the male was better off by working, even if it was a low income paid. But the woman with the child was better off on welfare than taking a job, even if it paid a considerable amount of money above. And that was because of all the benefits she got on welfare. At that time, it has changed somewhat. You used to get taxed on 100% of your earnings, so it was never in her interest to try to make any money. They cut that subsequently. But she also got health and dental benefits, not only for herself, but for her child. And at that point, you lost them the moment you took a job. She got a school supply fund. She got a snowsuit fund. It went on and on and on. And it was very easy to present. This is an economically rational decision on her part. This is not about being lazy whatsoever. And then the CEOs fought back. Well, that's all very sophisticated and very academic, but they don't understand that. So we arranged with St. Christopher's House in Toronto to create a focus group of people who were in this situation. And it reminded me of the story we always used to tell in Ottawa. If you want to know how employment insurance seasonal benefits operate, go to a fishing plant in Newfoundland and Labrador, because they know how it works way better. These people we met at St. Christopher's House knew the welfare rules inside and out. I said there's over 100 cells in that matrix. They knew every single one of those cells, and they knew exactly what they needed to do and not to do to be in a preferable cell. They had the thing absolutely cold. After that experience, we decided, because we have terrible, terrible measures of poverty in Canada, using this low-income kite-off, we decided we wanted to create a deprivation measure. And the notion was we would actually ask people what they thought would be the thresholds for being deprived and not being deprived. And the pushback with that will be, they're going to tell us, like they need a brand new car every 5 years, and it's going to be ridiculous and you can't trust it. Their answers were so insightful, and they were so reasonable. I need 2 pieces of footwear because we have different climates. I need a light jacket and I need a heavier jacket. They needed a basic form. And we actually, from those responses, were able to put together a very reasonable, I think, deprivation. But I don't know. I hate to say that. I don't know the ins and outs of living in that kind of situation. But boy, they do. And we could learn an awful lot from that.
Yeah. And it's just so important to have them part of that policy making and discussions and helping insightful on that. And to your point about, the welfare and the social security system, I have a former colleague who she has multiple degrees. She's actually overeducated, and she lives in social housing. She's a single mom of 5 boys. And it's cheaper for her because she gets subsidized to keep staying in school, but also while maintaining a full-time job. Because once she stopped doing school, her social programs got cut. So it's almost counterintuitive. So she's having that stress and burdens. I hope we're seeing a bit more of a shift in policy making and getting those perspectives. I really love how this conversation has shaped. I want to thank you so much, Don, for being here and sharing so many amazing insights, some history lessons here. Any closing thoughts?
It's going to be a tough period for Canada. We're going to need all the best policy advice we can get. As you said, the silver lining, it is bringing people together. I have an op-ed coming out later today in the Financial Post, and I'm suggesting all hands on deck to tackle these economic problems. And I think it will be very easy to get all hands on deck. Virtually every Canadian is going to be willing to contribute to this because we're scared, but I think we're patriotic, and we've got to see our way through this.
Very well said. And I want to thank you again. This was Don Drummond, a brilliant Canadian economist who's worked in various public, private, academic sectors for sharing his insights on Let's Talk Politics. And that's a wrap on our 3-part series with Don Drummond. I hope you had as much fun listening as I had diving into economics with him. Don't go too far. Next week, we're tackling the political chaos here in Canada, across the border, and around the world. You won't want to miss it. I'm your host, Julia Pinella. Thanks for tuning in to Let's Talk Politics. See you next time.